Growing up, the house always felt colder when Rebecca wasn't home. It wasn't the kind of chill you could fix by turning up the thermostat. It came from the way every room seemed brighter when she walked into it. Rebecca was the golden child, the family's pride. She had the effortless charm of someone who'd never known failure. She was the one who aced every test, led every team, and collected trophies like souvenirs. Her laughter echoed through the halls like a melody, and her presence was a beacon our parents gravitated toward. I, Jessica, was her shadow. Where Rebecca dazzled, I disappeared. I was the quieter one, the girl who preferred books to crowds, who struggled with a weak immune system and endless doctor visits. My grades were average, my presence easily overlooked. It wasn't that my parents didn't love me. They just didn't know how to celebrate ordinary when extraordinary was sitting right next to it. Growing up under Rebecca's radiance felt like trying to bloom in the shade of a towering oak. I learned early that comparisons weren't just inevitable. They were the foundation of our family dynamics. Look how Rebecca does it, or you should try harder like your sister. Those words built walls around me, each brick a reminder of my inadequacy. Over time, I stopped trying to scale them and focused instead on building a life where Rebecca wasn't the standard I had to measure up to. Leaving home was my first act of rebellion. I took a job as a schoolteacher in a quiet town far from the one I grew up in. Teaching gave me a sense of purpose, a space where I wasn't competing with anyone but myself. The children didn't care about my past or my comparisons. They saw me as someone who believed in them. It was in that small town, amidst lesson plans and parent-teacher conferences, that I met Alex. Alex wasn't like the other men I'd known. He was kind in a way that felt rare, a softness in a world that often demanded hardness. He had a quiet strength about him, the kind that didn't need to prove itself. When he looked at me, it wasn't with judgment or expectation, but with a warmth that melted the years of frost I'd carried inside. With Alex, I felt seen in a way I hadn't before, not as Rebecca's sister, not as someone trying to prove her worth, but simply as Jessica. Our relationship unfolded like the kind of storybooks I used to read to my students. He proposed in the middle of a thunderstorm, his words swallowed by the sound of rain, but his intentions clear in the way he held my hand. Our wedding was a small affair, just close friends and a few relatives. Rebecca, of course, stole the show even as a guest, but for once, it didn't matter. I had Alex, and for the first time in my life, I felt like the protagonist of my own story. Marriage brought stability, a sense of belonging I hadn't known before. Alex and I built a modest life together, full of shared routines and quiet joys. We spent weekends exploring nearby hiking trails, and evenings were reserved for takeout and movies. It was simple, but it was ours. I often found myself wondering how I'd gotten so lucky to have stumbled upon this oasis of calm after a lifetime of chaos. But happiness, I've learned, has a way of shifting when you least expect it. It started subtly, with Alex coming home later than usual. At first, it was easy to explain away, a busy week at work, a late meeting. But then there were the moments when his attention seemed elsewhere, his laughter a little more forced, his gaze a little more distant. I'd catch him staring off into the distance, his expression unreadable. When I asked if everything was okay, he'd smile and assure me it was just stress. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. But a familiar unease began to settle in my chest, a nagging sense that the life we'd built might not be as unshakable as I'd thought. For years, I'd lived in the shadow of someone else's perfection. Now, as cracks began to appear in the foundation of my marriage, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd unknowingly built another life on unsteady ground. The first time I stumbled upon something truly alarming was when I was cleaning out Alex's car. I'd borrowed it to run errands, and while returning it, I decided to tidy up. Beneath the driver's seat, I found a small, crumpled receipt from a restaurant I didn't recognize. The date on it wasn't alarming. It was from a night he'd told me he was working late, but the time and the fact that there were 2 entrees listed sent a chill down my spine. I tried to push the thoughts aside, telling myself it could have been a business dinner. Alex had mentioned meeting new clients recently, but the seed of doubt was planted, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, It began to grow. Looking back, that receipt felt like the first domino to fall, the beginning of a sequence I wasn't prepared to face. My life had always been defined by contrasts: Rebecca's light against my shadow, my calm against Alex's growing distance. I'd fought so hard to escape the comparisons of my past, to build something uniquely mine. But now, as unease settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that my story was about to take a turn I wasn't ready for. The distance between Alex and me wasn't something that happened overnight. It crept in slowly, like an unwelcome guest who refused to leave. At first, I dismissed it as work stress. He'd been taking on more projects lately, coming home later than usual, and spending hours in his office when he did. When I asked him about it, his answers were short and evasive, leaving me with more questions than comfort. The changes weren't just in his schedule. It was the way he looked at me, or rather didn't. Conversations that once flowed freely now felt forced, punctuated by long silences. I'd catch him scrolling on his phone late at night, his screen tilted away as though hiding something. My attempts to bridge the gap were met with excuses and irritation, until eventually, I stopped trying altogether. But the unease inside me didn't stop growing. One evening, I planned a quiet dinner at home. It was a small gesture, my way of trying to remind him of the life we'd built together. But when Alex walked through the door, the look on his face wasn't one of gratitude. Instead, it was a mask of grim determination. He didn't even sit down before he delivered the words that would change everything. He wanted a divorce. I stared at him, uncomprehending. He offered no details, no reasons that made sense. He spoke in vague terms about growing apart and needing space. My mind raced, trying to find the missing pieces of a puzzle I didn't even know existed. His demeanor was cold, detached, as if he'd already made peace with his decision. For me, it was like the ground beneath my feet had been ripped away. I asked him why, pleaded for an explanation, but he deflected every question. The man who once held my hand in a thunderstorm now stood before me, a stranger. The days that followed were a blur of disbelief and pain. I barely ate, barely slept. Each corner of our home seemed to mock me with memories of the life we'd built together. Friends tried to console me, but their words rang hollow. How could they understand the depth of this betrayal when I barely understood it myself? And then Rebecca arrived. Her entrance was as grand as always, sweeping into my home unannounced, her presence commanding the room. She was all smiles, her excitement barely contained as she dropped the bombshell. She was engaged. To Alex. My world tilted on its axis. The words didn't register at first. They were too absurd to be true. But Rebecca, with her perfectly manicured nails and saccharine smile, delighted in spelling it out for me. She'd been seeing Alex for months, she said, and now they were ready to take the next step. Her tone was triumphant, almost mocking, as if she'd been waiting for this moment to assert her dominance over me once again. I could barely breathe. The betrayal was more than I could process. It wasn't just Alex, it was Rebecca too. My sister. The person I'd spent a lifetime living in the shadow of. The person whose approval I'd craved despite knowing I'd never get it. And now she'd taken the one thing I thought was mine, the one person who'd made me feel special. Rebecca didn't try to soften the blow. She reveled in my pain, her words laced with the kind of cruelty only she could deliver. To her, this wasn't just a victory, it was a declaration that she'd won once again. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and disdain, as though I were something to be swept aside. I wanted to scream, to fight, to lash out, but all I could do was sit there in stunned silence as Rebecca laid out her plans for their future. She talked about the wedding, about how supportive Alex had been during their relationship, and how she hoped we could move past this. The audacity was staggering. When she finally left, the house felt emptier than ever. I was left alone with my thoughts, my emotions swinging wildly between rage and despair. The life I'd worked so hard to build was gone, dismantled by the two people I should have been able to trust the most. Alex's betrayal was devastating, but Rebecca's felt like the culmination of a lifetime of being second best. I began to question everything. my worth, my choices, even my own identity. The Jessica I'd worked so hard to become felt like a distant memory, overshadowed once again by Rebecca's brilliance. I'd thought I'd escaped her shadow, but it seemed she'd found a way to pull me back into it. The pain was suffocating, a weight I couldn't shake. Nights were the worst, the silence of the house amplifying every doubt and fear. I tried to distract myself with work, with books, with anything that would keep my mind occupied, but nothing helped. Every thought circled back to the same question: why? Why had Alex done this? Why had Rebecca? Why wasn't I enough? For the first time in years, I felt like that scared, invisible girl again, the one who could never measure up. The walls I'd built around myself, the life I'd carefully constructed, all of it had crumbled. I was left standing in the wreckage, unsure of how to move forward, or if I even could. The days after Alex and Rebecca's revelation blurred into weeks of suffocating despair. My life became a series of disconnected moments, each one tinged with a pain that felt impossible to escape. I'd wake up each morning with a crushing weight on my chest, my mind replaying the betrayal over and over. The world around me seemed to move forward, indifferent to the wreckage of my life, while I was left standing still, paralyzed by grief and humiliation. The divorce happened faster than I could have imagined. Alex, perhaps out of guilt or a desire to move on with his new life, made the process seamless. His lawyer presented me with an agreement that included a generous financial settlement, something I accepted without much thought. I didn't have the energy to fight. It felt like signing away the remnants of my old life, letting go of the marriage I'd once believed in. The money was a hollow consolation, a reminder of how easily he could replace our years together. In the aftermath, Rebecca and Alex didn't bother to hide their happiness. Social media became a gallery of their perfect life, each post a dagger to my already fragile heart. Pictures of lavish dinners, weekend getaways, and their radiant smiles flooded my feed. Rebecca, ever the master of theatrics, seemed to relish in showcasing their relationship to the world. Every like, every comment of admiration from mutual friends felt like another betrayal. I couldn't look away, though. It was a masochistic compulsion, scrolling through their lives, comparing my misery to their joy. One night, after yet another sleepless evening spent torturing myself with their posts, I made a decision. I deleted all my social media accounts. It felt like cutting off a lifeline, but I knew it was a lifeline to nowhere. Removing myself from the curated perfection of their lives was the first step toward finding some semblance of peace. I also stopped responding to Rebecca's attempts to reach out, which were few and far between. Her messages, thinly veiled in concern but dripping with condescension, were more than I could bear. My isolation became a cocoon, but even cocoons have their limits. I realized I couldn't stay trapped in my pain forever. Small steps became my salvation. I started therapy, hesitant at first but desperate for guidance. My therapist, a kind and patient woman, helped me unravel the layers of my hurt, showing me that my worth wasn't tied to Alex or Rebecca. She encouraged me to rebuild my life on my terms, not as a reaction to the betrayal, but as a declaration of independence. Work became another anchor. Teaching had always been my sanctuary, and now it offered a sense of normalcy I desperately needed. My colleagues, though unaware of the full extent of my personal struggles, offered quiet support through shared lunches and words of encouragement. The children in my class reminded me of life's innocence, their laughter and curiosity a balm for my wounded spirit. As the weeks turned into months, I began to take tentative steps toward rebuilding. I joined a book club where I met people who shared my love for stories and words. It was there that I found myself laughing again, a sound that felt foreign but welcome. I also started going for long walks, finding solace in the rhythm of my footsteps and the beauty of the world around me. Each small victory felt monumental, a sign that maybe, just maybe, I could move forward. Hope, though fragile, began to take root. It wasn't the kind of hope that promised an immediate fix or a perfect future. It was quieter, like the first hint of sunlight after a long storm. I started to believe that life could have meaning beyond the pain, that I could carve out a new identity separate from the roles I'd been forced into. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, I felt like it was one I could face. Looking back, I saw how much I'd given of myself in my marriage and in my relationship with Rebecca. I'd spent so much time trying to be enough for them, to prove my worth, that I'd forgotten to value myself. Now, I was learning to do just that. It was a slow process, full of setbacks and doubts, but it was mine. And that made all the difference. The call came late in the evening, just as I was settling in with a book. The number was unfamiliar, and for a brief moment, I debated ignoring it. But something compelled me to pick up, and in that instant, my world shifted once again. The voice on the other end was somber, delivering news I never expected to hear. Alex was gone. A sudden cardiac event had taken him, leaving behind more questions than answers. The news didn't register at first. I sat there in stunned silence, the words echoing in my mind but refusing to sink in. Despite everything he'd done, the thought of Alex being gone felt unreal. My emotions were a tangled web of shock, sadness, and a strange numbness that I couldn't quite explain. I hung up the phone, my hands trembling, and stared into the empty room. Once again, I found myself at the mercy of forces beyond my control. A few days later, I received a call from Alex's lawyer. He explained that Alex had left behind a letter and a will, both of which were meant for me. The thought of Alex planning something so deliberate was jarring. I didn't know whether to feel grateful or angry, but curiosity won out. I agreed to meet with the lawyer the following day. Sitting in the lawyer's office, I was handed a sealed envelope with my name written in Alex's familiar handwriting. The sight of it brought a lump to my throat. The letter was simple, just a few pages, but its contents unraveled a story I wasn't prepared for. Alex confessed that his actions, though hurtful, had been calculated. He claimed that he'd orchestrated the divorce and his relationship with Rebecca to protect me from her manipulations. According to the letter, Rebecca had been scheming for years, using her charm and our parents' favoritism to control those around her. Alex's relationship with her was meant to expose her true motives. He'd hoped that by aligning himself with her, he could uncover the extent of her plans and shield me from further harm. It was a convoluted explanation, one that left me reeling. His betrayal, it seemed, had been a sacrifice he believed necessary. The will added another layer of complexity. Rebecca, who had married Alex for what she thought was a $100 million inheritance, had unwittingly inherited a mountain of debt. Alex had funneled the majority of his personal assets into a separate account, one that he'd left to me. The lawyer explained that Alex had worked quietly to ensure I'd have financial stability, even as he played the role of Rebecca's partner. I didn't know how to feel. On one hand, Alex's efforts to protect me were touching, a testament to the love we'd once shared. On the other, his methods had left me broken and humiliated. The realization that Rebecca had been blindsided by the debts was a small, bitter comfort. Her perfect life, the one she'd flaunted so shamelessly, was crumbling before her eyes. Yet even that didn't erase the pain she'd caused. The personal savings Alex left me were more than I could have ever imagined. It was enough to rebuild my life, to finally have the freedom to dream without the weight of financial constraints. But the money felt tainted, a reminder of the chaos that had brought it into my hands. As I walked out of the lawyer's office, the envelope clutched tightly in my hand, I felt a storm of conflicting emotions. Grief for Alex, anger at his choices, and a fragile sense of hope for the future. That night, I sat with the letter, reading and rereading Alex's words. I tried to make sense of his motives, to reconcile the man I'd loved with the one who had orchestrated such a painful deception. It was impossible to untangle the emotions swirling inside me. The loss of Alex felt raw, but so did the betrayal. And yet, I couldn't ignore the gratitude I felt for his attempt to secure my future. It was a strange, bittersweet mix of emotions, one that I knew would take time to unravel. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to cry, not just for Alex, but for everything I'd endured. The tears came in waves, washing over me like a flood, leaving me drained but lighter. In the quiet aftermath, I realized that Alex's actions, as flawed as they were, had given me a chance to start over. It was a gift I hadn't asked for, one I wasn't sure I deserved, but it was mine nonetheless. As the days passed, I began to think about what I wanted my life to look like moving forward. Alex's letter had left me with more questions than answers, but it had also reminded me of my strength. I'd survived betrayal, heartbreak, and loss. I could survive this too. The path ahead wasn't clear, but for the first time, I felt like I had the tools to navigate it. And that, I realized, was its own kind of victory. The decision to move was not an easy one, but it felt necessary. The home I had shared with Alex was filled with ghosts, memories that clung to every corner. It was time to let go, to start anew. I found a small but charming house in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place that felt like it could be mine. The process of packing was cathartic. Each box sealed was a step toward leaving the pain behind. Moving day came with a mix of emotions. As the last box was loaded onto the truck, I took one final look at the house that had been the backdrop to so much of my life. There was no denying the sadness, but there was also a sense of relief, as though I was finally closing a chapter that had weighed me down for too long. The new house, with its warm light and inviting spaces, felt like a blank canvas. For the first time in a long time, I felt the stirrings of hope. Life in the new home marked the beginning of a journey toward rediscovery. I made a promise to myself to focus on growth, to build a life that was truly mine. I enrolled in online courses, diving into subjects I'd always been curious about but never had the chance to explore. It was exhilarating to learn again, to feel my mind expanding in ways that had nothing to do with the expectations of others. I also began to meet new people, joining local groups and attending community events. Each new connection was a reminder that the world was bigger than the pain I'd endured. Rebecca's attempts to reach out were persistent at first. Her messages ranged from defensive to apologetic, but I didn't respond. She'd made her choices, and I was done being a part of her games. Cutting her out of my life was liberating, a declaration that I would no longer allow her to dictate my emotions. The silence between us was not just an absence, but a space for me to breathe and heal. As the months went by, I found myself reflecting on the life I'd lived up until now. So much of it had been shaped by the expectations and actions of others. My parents, Rebecca, Alex, they had all left their marks, but I realized I no longer wanted to carry their weight. I began to redefine what happiness and success meant to me, not through anyone else's lens, but through my own. The process of rebuilding was not without its challenges. There were days when the grief felt overwhelming, when the weight of everything I'd lost threatened to pull me under. But there were also moments of triumph, small victories that reminded me of my resilience. I started painting again, a hobby I'd abandoned long ago. The act of creating something with my hands was therapeutic, a way to channel my emotions into something tangible and beautiful. One day, as I unpacked the last of the moving boxes, I came across a photograph of Alex and me from our honeymoon. For a moment, I felt the familiar sting of loss, but it was different this time. The pain was tempered by gratitude for the good times we'd shared, even if they hadn't lasted. I placed the photo in a small box labeled Memories and set it aside. It was part of my past, but it no longer defined my future. With each passing day, I felt more like myself, or perhaps a new version of myself. The woman who had been shaped by betrayal and heartbreak was giving way to someone stronger, someone who had learned to find joy in the simple moments. A walk in the park, a good book, the laughter of new friends, these became the building blocks of my new life. The culmination of this transformation came when I decided to host a small housewarming party. It was a modest gathering, just a few neighbors and friends I'd made along the way. As I looked around the room that evening, at the laughter and warmth that filled my new home, I realized I had done it. I had moved forward. The shadows of the past still lingered, but they no longer controlled me. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about Alex's letter and everything it had set in motion. His actions had hurt me deeply, but they had also given me the means to start over. For all the pain, there had been a strange kind of gift in his betrayal. It was a lesson in resilience, in finding strength even when the world feels like it's falling apart. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. My story wasn't over. It was just beginning. And for the first time, I felt ready to write the next chapter on my own terms.